Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. It's wonderful to see so many wonderful faces joining us for yet another exciting program. My name is Mariam Pira. I am the local wheel coordinator here in Chicago. I'm joined by my colleague Darius, as well as our friends from Commonweal Magazine and the Bernadine Center at CTU here in Chicago. We're very excited to have you all joining us. Before I lean into our introduction for our speaker this evening, I wanted to just share a couple of housekeeping tips. One, we're going to start using the spotlight feature in Zoom, and so I would invite you to use the speaker view so that you're getting sort of the maximum screen space for the person speaking in the moment during the presentation. And then when we switch to Q&A, you're welcome to use whichever view you prefer, but during the Q&A at the end of the program, if you want to see what other folks are doing and looking like, we can open it back up to gallery view. Some other points, we will have microphones muted during the program itself. This is really just to make sure we're not getting feedback and so that the speaker isn't distracted while she's presenting. We'll also ask that you please stay engaged throughout the conversation. Feel free to post questions, links, share thoughts and prayers in the chat box. We love seeing those. We have several moderators on the call who will be engaging with you and keeping track of questions. And then when we get to the Q&A at the end of the program, we will ask you if you're comfortable to please use your video feature so that we can see you and engage together in that way. So with that, I'm going to share a brief bio for our speaker this evening. MT Dávila is a visiting associate professor of practice at Merrimack College. She's a scholar focusing on racial and migrant justice, public theology, and the ethics of the use of force. She is co-editor of Living Without Border, Theological Ethics and Peoples on the Move, and she's also a regular contributor to Theology and La Plaza for National Catholic Reporter, the first Latino column in a national Catholic newspaper. She's also a contributing author for Miguel Diaz's new book, The Word Became Culture, in which she wrote a chapter, The Preferential Option, a challenge of faith in a culture of privilege. So with that, I will hand over to MT.
Thank you. Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. I was asked to place my comments both in the context of work that I do and why my chapter came to be part of this book, but also about how the book itself came to be put together. This is the first volume in a series called Disruptive Cartographers Doing Theology Latinamente. So this is a series from Orbis Books. And I think we will be posting the link. And this is the first volume in that series. It came about very interestingly in addition to that. After the election of Pope Francis and seeing the turn of the church to have a Latin American Pope and that vision, we took advantage of Latino theologians and the gift that Latino theologians in the US represent to the church in general, but especially a church led by a Latin American Pope. And so through Miguel Diaz, former US ambassador to the Holy See, we were able to get Cardinal Gianfranco Ravasi to come and visit with us in what was a sort of, it was a conference, but also really what's called a conversatorio, right? A conversation on culture. Cardinal Ravasi is the director of the Office of Culture. There's a official title he has that doesn't come to my mind right now, but I see Carmen's here, so maybe Carmen can put in his official title. And he literally came in a listening mode. He came to hear Latino theologians reflect on various dimensions of being Catholic and Latino in the US, but just in general, questions of how Latino theology is both gift and challenge to Catholic theology, to the Catholic Church in ecclesial questions, specifically on cultural issues. So that's sort of the context of the book itself. My contribution to the volume comes from my own background and work on the preferential option for the poor. That has been the focus of most of my work for most of my life as a scholar. And what I was hoping to provide in this chapter was really looking closely at that first phrase, preferential option, right? The concept of preferential option for the poor, that phrasing as that phrase that we receive, comes from mid to late 20th century Latin American theology. So it comes from a very specific context. It comes from a very specific political context, economic context, and cultural context, and a historical time in which Latin America as a continent was experiencing extreme poverty and extreme oppression. That being said, the phrase itself has become a central doctrinal element of the church. So, albeit a very recent one that really profiles and gives us language for speaking about God's partiality. That notion that, in fact, the God of the Bible is a God that is partial to the suffering of the poor. um, just in reflecting on that a little bit for tonight, just want to read some phrasing that I came up with just to really think about that for a moment. So divine partiality is an antidote to idolatry. And as an antidote to idolatry, we make of an impartial God who loves everyone equally an idol. And that's some of what I wanted to address in the chapter as well, that when we think of an impartial God, what we really is building an idol of a particular way of thinking about impartiality. There is really no such thing in the Bible. And so if we move away from that, if we move from the partiality of God for the suffering of humanity and the suffering of particular groups, we're essentially creating an idol. That God, an impartial God, would not have bothered to save the Jews from slavery in Egypt, demand to know the fate of Abel in the story of Cain and Abel, or cemented the political health of the people of Israel on the fate of the widow, the orphan, and the stranger, or the sojourner among us. It is God's extravagant grace poured out to all that explains the partiality of the incarnation of Jesus, who describes God's very being through stories exhibiting profound preferential option for the poor and the culturally marginalized. Such as in the story of the rich man and Lazarus and the Good Samaritan. These are stories that are central to Jesus' description of what the kingdom of God is like, of what it means to be human, and what it means to be before God and be judged by God. God's partiality as expressed in Jesus's life, the parables, and most clearly in the Sermon on the Mount, represent the kind of decentering that is the business of this God. And I'll get back to that in a moment. In the Beatitudes, this preferential option 4 is laid out as the great reversal of all our expectations about who wins and who loses in society. And when I introduce Jesus to my undergraduates, not assuming that many of them are not necessarily familiar with the Christian story, or if they're somewhat familiar with the Christian story, they might not have gone in depth into studying the person of Jesus. I described for them how one of the most attractive things about Jesus's teaching was this notion of reversal of fortunes, that when he opens his mouth in the Sermon on the Mount and utters the words, "Blessed are," the expectation from the audience is that what follows are the groups that classically represented at the time those who are in God's favor and blessing. But instead, Jesus follows that statement with "Blessed are the poor." And now the listener is paying attention because the poor is not a category that is typically understood as blessed in that social milieu. And then the kicker, because theirs is the kingdom of heaven, they're receiving an incredibly partial um, uh, fortune that reverses all social expectations of the time. And each of the Beatitudes does that. It shows that the nature of divine love is one that is unbounded, but one that is partial. So that's really at the heart of understanding the preferential option for the poor. Um, but what I wanted to do is in this chapter is really talk about what is the task for faith of that phrasing preferential option. And I used the word decentering in a few moments ago, and I focus on that in the chapter. The fact that once we get that phrase, once we get that contribution from Latin American theology, from the Latin American church to the church globally around the world, and it gets incorporated into ecclesial documents, it gets incorporated into magisterial documents. It's a phrase that is at the heart of Pope Francis's papacy, but also had been used by um, John Paul II and had been used by Benedict XVI before them, before Francis. Uh, Once we get that, we come to understand that the role of faith, of the faithful, is to see themselves as having to remap in a way that resists the common cultural and social dimensions. That it is the task of faith, in fact, to be both be decentered oneself, but also to do that across societal expectations and societal norms, because that is, in fact, what this God does. This is a God that acts with preference for the suffering out of abundant love and grace. And we are to imitate that way of being in the world. One notion that I talk about in this chapter is the resistance to that insight. So now we have an insight, like I said, comes from late 20th century. It gets incorporated into the life of the church, and yet there is extreme resistance to it. There is resistance to the notion, again, that God could be anything but impartial, loving everyone equally. And what I spend a little time doing in the chapter, and I've done this in other writings as well, is pointing out the ways that in fact cements ways, forms of idolatry that prevent that remapping, that task of remapping where we are standing with respect to the margins, where we are standing with respect to the Lazarus of the world, the Lazarus of our community and of our culture and of our society, and how we interact with the different kinds of margins that our society creates. And that doesn't mean that our society puts forth a preferential option for impartiality, but in fact puts forth a preferential option, what I call for the culture wars, that in the US especially, there is this push for placing the culture wars as we have been seeing them, obviously, every election cycle and in the past 40 years or so, being a central element of how Christians in the US behave in the public square, not so much decentering themselves by turning to a preferential option for the margins, but actually choosing to be centered through specific culture wars. So that's some of what I offer in the chapter with respect to that insight. Where does Latino theology come in? Latino theology comes in its rich story and in the rich contributions. This is not a homogeneous body of literature or theology. But what it does is it comes in this particular context in the US to offer resistance to that preferential option for impartiality and preferential option for order, an order that ends up being disorder for so many in our culture, and a preferential option for privilege that is part of our culture, social mobility, um, and other elements that really push back and resist that insight, that theological insight of a God that is actually partial to the suffering of humanity. So, Latino theology, by focusing, by putting a lens on particular experiences of the faithful in the US and observing their reading of how to live the faith in the US, will then open up dimensions of what this preferential option could look like within our context. So you have insights such as Ada Maria Isasi Diaz's Lo Cotidiano. Ada Maria Isasi Diaz is a Cuban immigrant, and she wrote Mujerista Theology. She wrote from a Latina women's perspective. And part of what she presented is a view of the everydayness of the struggle for life, la lucha, right, in Spanish, the everydayness of that struggle. She pointed that as being a central theological concept, that in fact, that is at the heart of who Jesus is. That is at the heart of who Jesus is for us. This notion of every day facing the struggle, every day facing that which deals death to so many Latino communities. And Isasitia spends a lot of time analyzing what are those things that deal death to Latino communities and in which way Latino communities confront that by observing their own fight, their own struggle, and noticing where God is in the dailiness, in the everydayness of that struggle. So that's one example of how Latino theology counters some of the resistance to a preferential option paradigm for understanding who God is. I'll give you another example, but then I want to sort of close that out so we can engage in more conversation. The other example comes from Roberto Goizueta. And Roberto Goizueta, another Cuban American theologian, speaks about Jesus as coming to our encounter, something that Pope Francis also offers us, right? That theology of encounter, and a theology that includes the Latino insight of nosotros, right? That for Latinos, our sense of being human is not a sense of the I who progresses, who wants upward social mobility, who is seeking achievements and pulling oneself by one's own bootstrap, but that the sense of Latino humanity, our sense of our humanity, our sense of who we are, is intimately tied to our communities, is intimately tied to the people we are accountable for. And therefore, there's a we-ness to Latino anthropology. That's one insight that Roberto Goizueta offers. And that also is intimately related to who Jesus is. And therefore, when we, in his sort of most prominent book, most salient book, Caminemos con Jesús, we're walking with Jesus. He takes that from the Good Friday processions that take place and in which Latino communities participate very prominently. That there is, in fact, a walking with the we, the nosotros, the community, with a Jesus that also decides to hedge his bets with the suffering, to wager with the suffering. And by using that term wager, I'm actually even going into someone like Orlando Espin, who talks about the way Latino theology offers up a vision of the faithful as those who put their hedge their bets on the truth of Jesus, that in fact, God is merciful and God is partial to their suffering. So there's so many other contributors to both this volume, but also to Latino theology in general, that offer diverse insights that help formulate that notion of preferential option for the US context. Even though it originates in Latin America, it is taken up by the church, and we have to make sense of it. We cannot just push it away simply because the church in the US might be married to some sort of bizarre idol of this God that treats everyone equally and is completely impartial in how this God cares for creation and the world and humanity. We need to counter that with the biblical witness of a God who does express partiality toward suffering and the specific suffering of humanity, even to death on a cross through the incarnation. And Latino theology offers ways of rereading that, reimagining that in the US context in ways that resist that push for the God who is impartial. So let me close with that, and we can have now some broader conversation.
Thank you, MT. There's a lot to talk about.